Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer, and I'm very excited to be here with David Nasaw, who is a terrific author, best-selling author, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, many books, including biographies of Andrew Carnegie and William Randolph Hearst. But today we're talking about his new book, The Wounded Generation: Coming Home After World War II, which was a wonderful read. David, thanks for joining the Long View.
My pleasure.
So this is a book about all the veterans who came back from World War II, that generation, and what that experience was like, and what the experience was like for their family, and a very different take, I think, than we are accustomed to for what has been called the greatest generation. Maybe we can just start a basic about how many people just served in the war, so we get a sense of the scale and scope.
Yeah, the World War II, we forget it was just more Americans served in World War II than in any other war, including the Civil War. 16, the figures vary between 16.1 and 16.4 million. 1/3 of males over the age of 15 served. And was astounding for me is comparing earlier wars, especially World War I. In World War I, the average length of service was a year. In World War II, the average length of service was 33 months. In World War I, half of the soldiers in the army went abroad. In World War II, it was 3/4 went abroad, served overseas, and a higher figure for blacks than for whites. More than that, and this is the astonishing thing for me, the average time overseas in World War I was less than 6 months. World War II, it was a year and a half. That was longer than, during the Civil War. Soldiers went home for the harvest. They went home to see their families. Very few, a small percentage, served overseas for a year and a half or away from their families for a year and a half.
Hmm. And before we get into some of the specifics, this book really deals with the aftermath. And today, people are familiar with all the effects of war, the trauma, the psychological effects. Were people after World War II in 1946 and 47, that whole period, were there terms to describe what it was like to come back and the problems? Were they aware that it's not a smooth transition, or were people not thinking of that yet?
The medical profession, the psychiatric profession, the VA didn't know what to do with these guys coming home. They referred to shell shock was a World War I term, so they weren't going to use it. They called it battle fatigue or combat fatigue. Battle fatigue or combat fatigue means that all you need is rest. You're tired. You rest a little, the fatigue goes away. PTSD was not discovered by the psychiatric profession until the middle 80s, 40 years after these guys came home. They came home, and not all of them, but large numbers, millions, irritable, filled with uncontrollable rage, unable to sleep, flashbacks, unable to get along with their families. The divorce rate was higher in 1946 than it had been or than it has been.
Hmm.
Um, the, the only cure or the only respite these guys got was alcohol. And the rate of alcoholism in the country, but especially among the veterans, was again higher than it's ever been. Um, it was an impossible transition. Now, the nation knew that. The home front knew that it was going to be tough getting these guys back. And one of the things I discovered is that the dominant narrative was split. There was a narrative, thank God, Johnny's come marching home in one piece. But Johnny's been away for a year and a half in a male-only environment. He's learned to become a killer, praised for wielding violence. God knows how many women he's been with abroad. How is he going to fit back in to the family? How is he going to fit back in to our society? Um, the films, the magazines, the newsreels were filled with foreboding about what was going to come next. The Los Angeles police chief in 1944 warned everybody that these guys are coming back with souvenirs. They come back from Europe, they're coming back with guns. If they come back from the Pacific, they're coming back with swords. Be careful. J. Edgar Hoover alerted the country that there was a crime wave on the way. The films were filled with images of dark, brooding, nasty, murderous, violent veterans who sometimes through the love of a good woman reformed, but the threat was still there.
You talk about Mickey Spillane at one point as conveying some of this in his work.
Mickey Spillane and Ross McDonald with bestsellers, 45, 46, 47. They had written before, but they caught on to a trend and started writing about veterans. Mickey Spillane's hero, if you can call her anti-hero, was a veteran. And in the first novels after the war, he takes revenge. He tells the police chief, you can't take care of this. I'm going to take care of this. The same with some of these, some of the uh, short stories. Argosy, men's magazine, was filled with stories of violence. The women's magazines carried any number of stories saying, be careful. Are you sure the same man has come home as left before? Uh,
And
the
you talk about, I mean, it had an effect on the families, and you have really terrible accounts of the alcoholism, the violence, how it affected relationships. I mean, you have a quote from the wife of a veteran, told the historian Studs Terkel, until the war, he never drank. When he came back, he was an absolute drunkard. He started slapping me around and slapping the kids. He came a brute. So it affected family life in pretty profound ways.
it certainly did, and one of the things a lot of infants were raised by their mothers and their grandparents during the war while daddy was away. There was a birth spur just before the war. Uh, the guys came back and they couldn't relate to their children. And there are lots of memoirs by children of veterans who talk about their fears of their fathers, their difficulties in getting along with them. There was an extraordinary study done at Stanford of fathers and children. And in it, it found that if the child born after the war, the father got along with, the child born during or immediately before the war, that the veteran had no hand in raising, he never quite got in touch, made the connections. Uh, the violence was endemic, but it was perhaps most severe in the South. Um, I found this extraordinary photograph from early 1945. Life magazine ran a story about Paris and the veterans in Paris and how Paris was trying to cope with these veterans who got drunk and went to the nightclubs and, were violent with women. And there was one picture of a couple that looked perfectly happy, no violence, but the American soldier was black and the woman was white. Photographs like this, letters from abroad by Southerners back home to their family, to their friends, to their politicians, prepared the South for what it expected was going to be another civil war. The violence that the returning veterans were met with was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I talk about some of it. There are some famous cases, but what happened was that men like Medgar Evers came back. They tried to organize. They tried to get their friends and family to go register to vote, to sit in the front of buses. The violence was such that it would take another decade before these veterans were able to organize the civil rights movement that we know about today.
And this was part of the double V movement, as it was known, in terms of transferring the fight for what they were fighting for abroad, back to the South. Another fascinating part of the book is, I mean, in '64, the Surgeon General will put out a big study about tobacco and raise awareness for smoking. You remind us that cigarette smoking even increases during wartime, in part because of the cigarettes distributed to soldiers. Can you talk
Yeah,
about that connection?
yeah. It's it caught me again unawares. I knew my father came back
Yeah.
smoking 3 packs of Luckies a day, which didn't do him any good. But I discovered that in the quartermaster's hierarchy, there was a special division, and its job was to get cigarettes, pack them, and send them abroad. The cigarette producers, the manufacturers, at very low cost, provided the Army and the Marines and the sailors with cigarettes. There were, I think the figure is 44 billion cigarettes were shipped to soldiers in 1944, and that was too low. The figure for 1945 was going to be over 100 billion. Soldiers in their ration packs, they got a half pack of cigarettes. The guys who went on D-Day were given a special gift of cigarettes. Um, when you went into combat, came out of combat, when you were in the rear, it was as essential an element of war. It was believed that it would calm you down. It was the only thing that would calm you down. And there are stories of soldiers going into war and trying to figure out how they're going into combat in the Pacific. How are they going to keep their cigarettes dry? The hell with the photograph of the girlfriend or the wife. Got to keep the cigarettes dry.
And in a very sobering chapter, so to speak, you also have kind of data on how they themselves thought of the wartime experience. And can you talk about that? Because it's, again, very different than some of the images that continue to be conveyed in textbooks and popular lore.
Yeah, one of the things I discovered was that the war was a period of extraordinary social science research. The Roper Foundation was born and took off. There were any number of universities, especially University of Chicago in particular, and then Princeton, did all of these studies, these opinion studies of the home front and of soldiers. And they discovered when the soldiers came home, um, more than half of them believed that they were going to return to a depression, that they'd never get a job. When asked, are you better off than you were before the war? An incredibly high percentage
Mm.
said no, no, I'm not better off. Now, for the black soldiers, it was a different world because they were not allowed in combat. So they learned skills that they never would have learned at home in the South. They learned how to drive trucks. They learned how to do construction. They learned all sorts of communications. They came back expecting more, expecting that they could leave sharecropping, or they could leave agriculture and get jobs. And they quickly discovered that that was not going to be the case.
And they couldn't get used cars, it turns out, either. There were shortages of basic goods.
There were shortages when you can't just on a dime, you can't wave a magic wand and go from a war economy to a peace economy. There were no white shirts. Guys came back. There's one story about how he had to enlist his uncle, who gave a bribe to the local haberdasher who found a white shirt because this guy was getting married. There were no suits, and they all came back looking. They couldn't fit into their suits. Richard Nixon was recruited to run for Congress on the West Coast. He had been in the war. He was a lawyer. He was a fast talker. He was married, had kids, was perfect candidate, but he didn't have any clothes. So one of the first things his donors did was buy him a suit of clothes. Forbes also ran for office. He had to campaign in his uniform, and his friends told him, "You're never going to win." And he didn't win because the civilians who were not in uniform aren't going to vote for you because they think you're showing off. And the soldiers who fought in the war don't want to be reminded what they went through. For the black soldiers, the lack of clothing was deadly. They had no choice but to wear their uniforms because they couldn't afford used clothes or new clothes because of the shortage. Prices were way up. And if the whites believed that was a direct provocation to see a black man in the uniform of the United States of America.
And one of the landmark pieces of legislation connected to the returning vets was the GI Bill of Rights, which provided educational opportunities, home ownership. But you go through that and you call it a double-edged sword, and you talk about some of the discrepancies and differences of experience with that bill, and even scam courses that some of the money went to. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the underside or problematic elements of the GI Bill of Rights?
The only way that the GI Bill was going to get through Congress, because it looked too much like an extension of the New Deal. The only way it was going to get the support of the Midwestern Republicans and the Southern Democrats was local control, state control. So the federal government gave away the money, but the local people decided who was going to get it. So in the South, there was special unemployment compensation for veterans. The Southern white officials didn't give it to blacks. They said, "Oh, there's always jobs for you. Go back to the farm, go back to your old job. You're not getting unemployment insurance." Throughout the South, there were strict laws segregating universities and colleges and even vocational schools. So the black veterans couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill because they couldn't get into a school and then have their tuition paid. But the most long-lasting, the greatest differential, I think, is in the mortgage guarantees. In order to get a mortgage guarantee, you had to have a local bank, approve you for a mortgage, which the VA would then guarantee. Black veterans in the South could not get mortgages. Black veterans in the North could not get mortgages. Black veterans North, South, East, and West could not get into Levittown and a dozen other suburban developments that went up in the post-war period. The effects of that lasted generations and generations and generations. My father got a GI Bill. We bought a nice house in the suburbs when I was 8 years old, I think, just at the end of the GI Bill. The GI Bill gave capital to white veterans. That capital increased dramatically because the housing prices went up from 45 to 60. So the white veteran population had an entree into the middle class through schools, through home ownership that African Americans never got. And women never got. Women could not get bank loans, even if they had been veterans, if they were single. If they were married, the guy had to get the bank loan.
I have a few more questions before I do. I always thank all our subscribers who are watching live and everyone who's going to watch once I post this on video. Thank you for subscribing, and I do hope you'll consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Long View. Just hit the little button, and it supports me being able to bring people like David and having these interviews with such thoughtful writers about our past and about our present. You've mentioned your dad twice, and so there is a connection. How important was that as you thought of writing this book and taking on the project? I mean, was there that personal dimension to your tackling this subject?
Yeah, yeah. There were there were two pushes. I mean, I was really pushed in a way that I haven't been. Usually, when I finish one book, as you know, you hunt around for the next one. This one was there all the time. One, because I had written The Last Million about refugees from World War II, and it had become abundantly clear that wars do not end with ceasefires, do not end with peace treaties. The second, for the veterans of World War II, that was especially the case. The war did not end. They brought it home with them. My father was a lawyer. He ended up in Eritrea running a hospital because they didn't know what else to do with him. Something happened in Eritrea. I don't know what. He developed a heart condition, was given a full medical research, a full medical discharge, came home an alcoholic, smoking 3 packs of Luckies a day, with a heart condition. He did not talk about the war. One of the things I've learned, you talk to 10 children of veterans, and 9 of them, 9.5 of them, are going to say, I never had a conversation with my father or my mother about what went on in the war. They didn't talk about their service. My father never talked about his service. So I don't know what happened. He died at age 61 from the heart condition that he had developed during the war. He stopped drinking, but he never stopped smoking, which didn't help his life very much. And that silence sort of pushed me as a historian to, because I couldn't find the records I wanted to, and I never had the conversation with my father, to jump into the archives and to write a history of this period.
The final question is just looking back now, and what the book does so well is it takes an entire generation and it really changes, I think, how many people will think of what they brought back and the experiences and struggles they faced, and their families, equally important. We have accounts of what the greatest generation, when we think of them that way, contributed and added to the country. But when you think of them as the wounded generation, in terms of where American history goes, what do you think the impact was of the war and the effects of the war on American society more broadly?
First of all, it spurs the Black veterans can't do anything until the early and middle 50s. And then they are absolutely instrumental in the civil rights movement. Absolutely. So that's number one. Number two, the inequalities, racial and gender, that had begun to shrink during the war and during the Depression were exacerbated by the effects of the GI Bill. Three, I think the silence of the veterans left the narrative to be developed by Ronald Reagan, Tom Brokaw, Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and it was a narrative of heroism and victory. Donald Trump wants to do away with Veterans Day, and he wants to do away with Memorial Day. And he wants to call these holidays Victory Day for World War I and Victory Day for World War II. So the heroism has been replaced by the sense that we can solve any problem through military force. And that is unfathomably dangerous. And it has been since World War II. If the wounded generation had been able to talk, to tell the stories that I now tell, maybe we would have understood the fruits of war are not simply the evolution of a greatest generation, but the fears of a wounded generation.
So, for those of you who don't know his work, David is a phenomenal writer. So, this is a book and all his books, which are a pleasure to read. But this is also just a book that changes the way you think of a period and experience. And I think that makes it very special. Again, it's called The Wounded Generation Coming Home After World War II. I really highly recommend reading this. And thank you for writing it. And thank you for joining the Long View.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.